You are listening to TBR Radio Presents The DIXIE Heritage Show, with your host, the Director of DIXIE Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
I just finished having a wonderful conversation with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson, and we were discussing the Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1905. We also discussed a little bit about the 1905 attempted revolution there in Russia, and it of course did not gain traction. But was it or was it not the precursor that basically was the catalyst or the match lit, if you will, that ultimately gave us the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution? And that was the discussion between Dr. Johnson and I over on my other radio show, TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. And we ran out of time, as we often do in those conversations. And I was just getting to the point of asking Dr. Johnson if the things that happened in Russia back in 1905 and in 1917, if those revolutions, if they had any similarity to what is going on in the United States now. Because as I remember my Russian history, which I'll admit is not as solid as my understanding of American history, but was that monuments and statues and violent protests and ethnically based and racially based protests and so forth were very predominant, especially in the 1917 revolution. And then within a few months after that, of course, the statues coming down and the ethnically, racially based protests and so forth, Russia was in full-blown revolution. And the government and the society as people knew it began to collapse and fall. And so I wanted to ask Dr. Johnson, who's probably the foremost expert in all things Russian here in the United States, are we seeing the same thing here in our country? And he, of course, is answering this question. And of course, again, our conversation was primarily based on Bloody Sunday, which was an event that took place in St. Petersburg, Russia, back in 1905. Tell me, are there any similarities between what's going on in Russia at that time? Obviously there were forces within the country who were trying to stir up revolt and rebellion and, stir up the masses and stir up protest and so forth. And we're seeing the same things happen here in the United States today. Is there any similarity?
Well, I gave a brief answer to that already. I think the foreign funding is a big similarity. The press manipulation is another. The dissimilarities are the fact that there's no major war. The internet makes it possible to gain alternative sources of information. The patriots tend now to outnumber the leftist forces today. Without funding from the banks and without media cover, I don't think these organizations could function. As you well know, Black Lives Matter is run by Miss Rosenberg, who was part of the violence in the 1960s, is one of the major leaders of Black Lives Matter. There's a few others, I can't think of their names off the top of my head, taking what blacks think are, or some blacks anyway, think are legitimate grievances, which they're not, and then using that for their own purposes. Again, that's something that's similar too. But rather than the police showing firmness and thereby ending this once and for all, they're doing just the opposite. And in fact, are demonizing anybody who tries to defend themselves. So you may have heard by now, the St. Louis couple now has felony charges laid against them. Now the governor of Missouri has said that he's going to, if they're convicted, which they can't be, it's just a message sent to them, sent to everybody who wants to defend themselves. I don't think they can be convicted, but even if they are, the governor's going to immediately pardon them. But traitors are everywhere. I mean, the state in the U.S. is a huge backer of Black Lives Matter, despite the fact, and despite Trump, who can barely rule on his own today, and he's subject to the same cowards that Tsar Nicholas was. So there's definitely similarities, but it's certainly not identical.
Well, you had mentioned, and we might have been off air when you had said this, that Black Lives Matter was getting billions of dollars from Bank of America and from other major banks. And given who you've said is running Black Lives Matter, is this just basically the bankers taking money out of their right pocket and putting it into their own left pocket? Or, who is this money actually going to?
Well, I have no reason to think that it's not going to anything other than the groups that they're intended to get it. A lot of people are getting wealthy off these movements. There's this rise, I don't know if you read a few articles, the so-called rise of anti-Semitism among black leaders. That's going to be a huge challenge for the bankers. And if they ever cut them off, that's going to be the reason. But I think the people who control them are going to be able to put the lid on this. I'm not sure if people like, Kanye West are able to really sway the masses. Now, I don't know if you've noticed either that most of these pictures, they're mostly white people at these demonstrations, especially in white areas. Black Lives Matter has become really a white movement, with a few exceptions. Now, initially, after the Floyd's overdose in Minneapolis, it was black, but that ended very, very quickly, and it was then hijacked and taken over by white elements. And of course, Antifa and Black Lives Matter have fought it out in the streets too, because the minute Black Lives Matter starts becoming black nationalist and quoting Farrakhan and people like that, and all of a sudden, Antifa is now at war with them. They've duked it out in a few places already, which is fine by me. That's something that you're not going to get out of the press. So I have no reason to believe this money isn't going to them. But just like Bloody Sunday, it's a hijacking of a movement that would have petered out by now.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
So, Bloody Sunday, 1905. Do you think that, of course, the official story here is that it was one of a chain event of things that culminated in, the people rising up in 1917 and overthrowing the empire and, forming the glorious Soviet whatnot. Is there any truth to that, or was this something that happened, it ended, and didn't have any subsequent influence on, in other words, the subsequent history, or the subsequent things we now know as the history, would have taken place, the Soviets would have come to power, blah, 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 whether the Bloody Sunday of 1905 happened or not, or was this really the matchlight and the catalyst and the spark that began the flame?
Without foreign funding and without the war, the left would have been just a handful of cranks at this point, because the economy had done very, very well from, throughout the late 19th century all the way up until the end of World War I. The peasantry owned the land. You had the lowest taxes, you had the lowest cost of living, and therefore the highest wages. You had a monarchy that had very little to do with the day-to-day actions of local government. You had the peasant commune, which still existed, despite having been injured by people like Witte and others. And so, the press, I like everything else, I'm willing to blame the press for most of this. Yeah, the money is a huge element. But if the press wasn't covering for them, and if the press was telling the truth, I'm not so sure any of this could have happened. And the Germans were really stupid to be sending money to this group of people who they knew were preaching global revolution. And as you know, one of the things that brought Hitler to power later was the takeover of Bavaria. And it became the Bavarian People's Republic, which was 100% Jewish. Same thing for the Hungarian People's Republic. These were 100% Jewish at the government level. So the Germans were idiotic to use these people to overthrow the Tsar, because they were well aware of what their agenda really was. As far as the Bolsheviks were concerned, Bloody Sunday is a huge part of their mythology, because they saw that this radicalized the population, and therefore it was a popular movement from there on in. That was never the case.
I'm going to ask you the same question in regard to what's going on now, Black Lives Matter and some of this other stuff that we're seeing now. Is this going to be a Roman candle of sorts, and it's going to make a big splash, and it's going to make a big scene, and it's going to look like a lot, but once it fizzles out, it's not going to have had a whole lot of impact on the ongoing history of the nation and the world? Or do you think that this is the beginning, and we're about to see far worse and radical change and major revolution on the horizon?
It's going to depend on what happens in November. Now, I know the polls are fake and rigged like they always are. They were 4 years ago, so you can't trust any of that. The other issue, too, is that the left is at 100% mobilization. They can't, their barrel is almost totally full. They can't put another drop in there. They're at full mobilization in terms of people on the street and money. Our people haven't even begun to mobilize yet. White people are now beginning to think in racial terms. I'm seeing this all over the place. People who didn't give a damn about politics now are talking about black radicalism and condemning it. They would never have spoken like this if Black Lives Matter didn't do what they did. The other issue, of course, is what the state does. Trump apparently is taking action in Portland, but like what happened during the march in 1905, the minute the state remains firm and suits a few people, then all of a sudden it goes away. When these cops were kneeling in front of the Black Lives Matter, that just gave them the green light to continue their act. But the minute the state starts killing a few people, as it should do, then it's going to peter out. So those are the three variables. I mean, there's many more, but those are the three many major variables to me that are underlying what's going to happen in the future.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
And so I read today that, there were some constitutional changes in Russia, and everything that we're seeing in the media is how horrible it is that Vladimir Putin was able to manipulate constitutional changes so that he can, become the president for life. And of course, we all know what a bad rap Putin gets in the media. One of the other things that I saw that's been very buried in news reports and usually not there at all is that the primary changes to the Russian constitution had to do with things like, for example, making it, they did away with gay marriage or made it so it would be impossible for that to happen. They made it to where sodomites cannot adopt children, which, let me just say, is a very good thing, which tells me that Russia's far more Christian than America is. I'll just leave it at that. But, I mean, I just kind of want to get your opinion of those things, of what's going on in Russia right now with the constitutional changes. Obviously, there seems to be a wave or a revival of morality and just tradition Christian morality that's sweeping through Russia right now. What do you think about that?
Well, it's not vague, generic Christianity. Most of that in America is completely folded and supported the left and the state. No, this is a growing, very militant orthodoxy there. Now, as far as the constitutional amendments are concerned, it's essentially making it a brand new constitution. I'll refer the listeners to my broadcast on that topic at Radio Albion, where I spent an hour going over this in great depth. There's 203 amendments total. I couldn't get to all of them, but I got to the main ones. Now, because that's too complicated, apparently, for the American press, who doesn't even know what's going on, they just talk about Putin's desire for power, which, of course, he doesn't have. He has no interest in remaining president until 2032 or whatever it would. I think it's 2032. He's going to be leaving relatively soon. Although the Russian population doesn't want that. They've said over and over again in polls from all over Russia that they want him there as long as he could possibly survive, because of the growth of the economy from the minute he took over in 2000. He doesn't want to do that. Power, especially under his circumstances, is an extremely difficult and painful thing. And of course, he's already put a new government in place that's going to be he already has a successor picked out, and the former head of the tax department. I'll say this about the press one more time. The media have no obligation to educate you. They have no obligation to tell you the truth. Reporters aren't expert in the things that they write about. A journalism degree is about finding the story. And the story either is about promoting the leftist agenda or maintaining readership, getting people addicted to either internet or TV news or the newspapers or whatever. That's their job. They have no obligation to tell anyone the truth. The idea of the old foreign correspondent is gone. These major media companies can't afford them anymore. So none of these guys are really, they don't go there. They don't read the language. They know very little about it, but they pretty much say what the agenda has them say. And because these amendments are fairly complex, all they talk about is Putin's terms in the future. But again, he has a successor already picked out. So and whoever he says is his successor is going to win. Because again, the liberal parties combined with all the CIA money end up polling like 5% at the most in every presidential election. So whoever Putin crowns is going to end up winning whatever election he wants. So he has absolutely no desire to rule much longer. It's an exhausting life. It's not something that any normal person would want to seek. But Russia is the leader of the free world. The U.S. is, of course, an atheist state, at least officially. God can't be mentioned in any public gathering. So it's officially atheist in that sense. It's officially materialist, and it's scientific element. And of course, there's minimal differences between the capitalism of the conglomerate and finance capitalism on the one hand and Marxist socialism on the other. Solzhenitsyn spent a lot of time showing them to be identical ideologies. But as far as the constitutional amendments are concerned, please go to Radio Albion and listen to my hour-long broadcast on that topic.
Welcome to the Christendom Curriculum. Every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom Curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America, and we do so without apology. The Christendom Curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We support the right of the European and American peoples to their historic Christian cultures against the globalist leftists who want to destroy those cultures. Not only that, but we provide assigned reading courses for various hot-button subjects in our current culture wars, including feminism, social justice, and cultural Marxism, among others. These reading courses will teach your kids how to survive a social justice warrior attack, how to debate with leftists on social media, how to reform their local churches and communities, and more. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom Curriculum is for you. Click the Learn More button to get in on the action. And thanks for listening.
And I still can't decide what my exact take is on COVID. Obviously, I don't think it could be anywhere near as bad as we're being told it is, and I think we're being told it's as bad as it is because I think we have a government, or at least some people within the government, who are just evil and want to manipulate this.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a partisan issue. It's not common that diseases are a partisan matter. COVID is not really a big deal unless you're very elderly, you're very sick with something else. It's not a problem for most of us to get. So the whole thing is phony. And masks, of course, aren't fine enough to keep the microbes out. So the whole thing is just a matter of conformism. I've been thrown out of everywhere by now, even claiming to be asthmatic. And even that's not enough. I say, well, I'm not allowed to wear one. No policy of yours can overthrow that. But even that's not sufficient anymore. It's really a sign of control and submission than having any health consequences.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
And that was basically the end of a conversation that I had with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. As I said, we began that broadcast, we began that conversation, a whole hour's worth of great conversation that took place between Dr. Johnson and I over on my other radio show, TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. So I refer you to www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org. Click over there and listen to that first hour of conversation between Dr. Johnson and I as we were talking about the specifics of Bloody Sunday, 1905 in St. Petersburg, Russia. What I want to do now for the remainder of the half hour is I want to kind of go over the highlights, or at least what I thought were the big parts, of an interview. President Trump was on Fox News Sunday. He was interviewed by Chris Wallace. And I just think that the president just really was able to set the record straight on a couple of things. And so let's just play a few clips from that interview, and I will have a little bit of commentary that I'll just kind of sprinkle in.
There has been a spike in violent crime in America in recent weeks. We've seen deaths up in New York, deaths up in Chicago, shootings. How do you explain it, and what are you going to do about it?
I explain it very simply by saying they're Democrat-run cities. They're liberally run. They're stupidly run. We have forced them in Seattle to end the CHOP because, we were going in that following day. You probably have heard it. We were getting ready to go in. We were all set. And when they heard that we were going, they set their police force.
Liberal Democrats have been running cities in this country for decades.
Poorly.
Why is it so bad right now?
They've run them poorly. It was always bad, but now it's gotten totally out of control. And it's really because they want to defund the police, and Biden wants to defund.
Maybe you remember last week when President Trump told the CBS reporter that there were more whites being killed by police in America than there were blacks. They challenged him then, and Chris Wallace will attempt to challenge him on that now. But listen very subtly to what Chris Wallace is about to say, because while he's telling the president that that fact is not true, he'll say, well, yes, there are more whites that are being killed, but in per capita numbers, there are more blacks. In other words, Chris Wallace is admitting, while trying to refute the president on this point, he is actually admitting that there are more whites being killed by police in this country than there are blacks.
The George Floyd murder has reignited the issue of racism in policing in this country. I want to give you a couple of statistics. Nationwide, blacks are twice as likely, fewer in absolute numbers, but in terms of per capita, blacks are twice as likely to be shot and killed by police as whites are.
Many whites are killed also. You have to say that. I mean, many whites are killed. I hate the sound, but this is going on for decades. This is going on for a long time, long before I got here. If you look at what's gone on in Portland, those are anarchists, and we've taken a very tough stand. If we didn't take a stand in Portland, we've arrested many of these leaders. If we didn't take that stand, right now you would have a problem like, they were going to lose Portland.
And of course, Chris Wallace kept challenging the president on his assertion that Joe Biden wanted to defund the police, saying Joe Biden doesn't want to defund the police. Joe Biden never said that. And so he pulls out some evidence. Chris Wallace pulls out some evidence to prove that Joe Biden does not want to defund the police. Joe Biden just wants to redirect funds away from the police. How is that not defunding the police?
Biden has called for redirecting some police funding.
And then Chris Wallace began to ask a series of questions about the Confederate battle flag and about bases named for Confederate generals and so forth. And so I'll kind of let the president speak for himself here, but I've got to say I really did like the president's answers, especially when he asked. He said, well, if we rename these bases, who are we going to name them for? Are we going to call it Fort Reverend Al Sharpton? Just some great stuff here. Listen up.
You said that Black Lives Matter and the Confederate flag are both issues of freedom of speech. Yeah. But in the case of the Confederate flag, there are a lot of people who say these were traitors who split from this country, fought this country in large part to preserve slavery. Is the Confederate flag offensive?
It depends on who you're talking about, when you're talking about. When people proudly had their Confederate flags, they're not talking about racism. They love their flag. It represents the South. They like the South. People right now like the South. I say it's freedom of many things, but it's freedom of speech.
So you're not offended by it?
Well, I'm not offended either by Black Lives Matter. That's freedom of speech. And you know, the whole thing with cancel culture, we can't cancel our whole history. We can't forget that the North and the South fought. We have to remember that. Otherwise, we'll end up fighting again. You can't just cancel all of it.
But let me ask you this when it gets to be more than just cancel. Well, maybe this is cancel culture. The National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, you have threatened to veto it because in the bill, and this is supported by Republicans as well as Democrats, it would rename Army bases named for Confederate generals. Now, this is a bill that funds military operations. It gives soldiers a pay raise.
Yeah.
You're going to veto that?
Because they'll get their pay raise. Hey, look, don't tell me this. I got soldiers the biggest pay raises in the history of our military. I got soldiers brand new equipment, brand new jets, brand new rockets, brand new $2.5 trillion. I did more for the military than any president that's ever had this office.
But you're going to veto this
because
bill?
I think that Fort Bragg, Fort Robert E. Lee, all of these forts that have been named that way for a long time, decades and decades.
But the military says they're for this.
Excuse me. I don't care what the military says. I'm supposed to make the decision. Fort Bragg is a big deal. We won 2 world wars. Go to that community where Fort Bragg is in a great state. I love that state. Go to the community. Say, how do you like the idea of renaming Fort Bragg? And then what are we going to name it? You going to name it after the Reverend Al Sharpton? What are you going to name it, Chris? Tell me what you're going to name it. So there's a whole thing here. We won 2 world wars. 2 world wars, beautiful world wars that were vicious and horrible. And we won them out of Fort Bragg. We won them out of all of these forts that now they want to throw those names away. And no, I'm against that. And you know what? Most other people are. And I don't believe in polls because I see the fakest polls I've ever seen. But that poll is a 64% thing, which actually surprised me. We won world wars out of these military bases. No, I'm not going to go changing them. I'm not going to go changing them. I might. Yeah, I might.
General Robert E. Lee once said that it is good that war is so terrible. Otherwise, we might grow too fond of it. Maybe that's why the president could say such a thing as we fought 2 world wars. Very, very beautiful wars. Indeed, a war is a horrible thing, as even the president pointed out, and a lot of people die. And I don't know that there ever is such a thing as a beautiful war. But I do get the president's point that these are the bases from which America's greatness militarily has been coming from for the last several decades. And again, who are we going to rename them for? The Reverend Al Sharpton? Barack Obama? Give me a break. Anyways, we are out of time here for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. And I'm so glad that at least right now the president seems to have a little bit of backbone on this subject of our Southern heritage and our Confederate heritage. And we're praying, of course, and we're lobbying him to stand firm in his resolve that he's not going to allow for the renaming of these bases. As he said, he's the commander-in-chief. The decision is his. Anyways, we are out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. Go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. When you're there, I will enable you to sign up for a free copy of my weekly email newsletter. And when you do, I'll also send you absolutely free of charge a copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And so I will be back here at this same time, this same place again next week. Please do tune in. Until then, God bless.